Hey guys, so I wanted to do a really quick unofficial video because I was doing some light reading today while at a pool that I was at this evening. So yes, very light reading. If you've not read this, the Gulag Archipelago, you should definitely read this. It's blowing my mind, to say the least. I think I've shared some about this on my blog, but you should read it. I'm not even that far in and my mind's blown. But I wanted to just share with you a little bit of what I was reading because it was so powerful, particularly in light of arbitrary power and the kind of dangers of arbitrary power that I'm always talking about. So let me read this to you. This is chapter 2 in the Gulag Archipelago, which I realize I should maybe tell you what the Gulag Archipelago is about. Briefly, it's written by Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn. He spent some time in a gulag in Soviet Russia. Basically, he was a political prisoner. And this was during the height of communism. And he wrote a book, or kind of a memoir, detailing the horrors of communism in Soviet Russia. And so this was a big tell-all book. It really exposed communism for what it is. And he goes through and he talks about what actually happened in communist Russia. It exposes it, all of the warts and everything, which that's pretty much all it is. In this first part of the book, he talks about basically all of the rounding up of different types of people. Tons of people were being rounded up and thrown into prison camps or into gulags. And this is what's really interesting. So I'm going to read this to you. I'm nerding out a bit. I'm just letting you see me nerd out a bit, okay? So Stalin's new line suggesting that it was necessary in the wake of the victory over fascism, so this is after World War II, to jail more people more energetically and for longer terms than ever before had immediate repercussions, of course, on political prisoners. So the year 1948 to 1949, notable throughout Soviet public life for intensified persecution and vigilance, was marked by one tragic comedy hitherto unheard of, even in Stalinist anti-justice, that of what he called the repeaters. That is what, in the language of the Gulag, they called those still undestroyed unfortunates of the 1937 vintage, so when they originally rounded up a bunch of people to go into gulags, who had succeeded in surviving 10 impossible, unendurable years, and who in 1947 and 1948 had timidly stepped forth onto the land of freedom, worn out, broken in health, but hoping to live out in peace what little of their lives remained. But some sort of savage fantasy or stubborn malice of unsated vengeance pushed the victorious Generalissimo, I don't know if I pronounced that correctly, into issuing the order to arrest all those cripples over again, without any new charges. It was even disadvantageous, both economically and politically, to clog the meat grinder with its own refuse. But Stalin issued the order anyway. Here was a case in which a historical personality simply behaved capriciously toward historical necessity. And so it was necessary to take all of them, though they had hardly a chance to attach themselves to new places or new families. They were rounded up with much the same weary indolence they themselves now returned with. They knew beforehand the whole way of the cross ahead. They did not ask, what for? And they did not say to their families, I'll be back. They put on their shabbiest rags, poured some word I don't know into their camp tobacco pouches, and went off to sign the deposition. Only one question. Are you the one who was in prison? Yes. Take 10 more. I'm going to keep reading for a second. At this point, the autocrat decided it wasn't enough to arrest just those who had survived since 1937. What about the children of his sworn enemies? They too must be imprisoned. They were growing up, and they might have notions of vengeance. He may, and then he has in quotations here, Solzhenitsyn, he may have had a heavy dinner and had a nightmare about those children. Sorry guys, the sun's getting really bright. Think about this. Arbitrary power. What do I say about arbitrary power? Arbitrary power is power that comes from nowhere, right? It's just on a whim. It's whatever and however someone who has the power feels in the moment, and there's nothing to confine that power. This right here is the exact example of what happens when government has arbitrary power. And this is why Solzhenitsyn says he may have had a heavy dinner and a nightmare about those children. So randomly, he decided these children of previous prisoners should all be arrested simply because he felt the need. And every prisoner who had been in prison during the war and was now released was supposed to be rounded up, and was rounded up again for no reason other than Stalin felt that it was necessary. And therefore, that's what happened. And the book goes on and it describes how not only were people arrested for a handful of other crazy things, but people were arrested for eating cucumbers, stealing a cucumber. Here, it says, we already have mentioned the famous law of 7/8, or 7/8, on the basis of which they arrested people right and left for taking a stalk of grain, a cucumber, 2 small potatoes, a chip of wood, a spool of thread, all of whom got 10 years. If a young girl sent into the field, this is crazy. If a young girl sent into the fields to get a few ears of grain took along 2 friends for company, this would be called an organized gang, or some 12-year-old youngsters went after cucumbers or apples, they were liable to get 20 years in camp. In factories, the maximum sentence was raised to 25 years. This should be read by all Americans. This entire book should be read by all Americans. It should be required reading, because this is what arbitrary power looks like. This is what happens when our government gets away with acting outside of its confines. If they can do that one time, if they can act outside of the Constitution one time, there's nothing stopping them from doing this. That's arbitrary power. So, anyway, that's my light reading for the summer. A nice warm summer day. Read the Gulag Archipelago. All right, I hope you guys have a good night.